Before we start adding behaviors to our player, we're going to go ahead and create a game manager. A game manager is a loose term, and it generally means some object, some script, or some collection of scripts that keeps track of the very important different pieces of a game, such as did the player win, did the player lose, what's the player's score, what's happening right now. Generally speaking, a game manager is not something you normally need simply to create a player that can move around. In the Zombie Toys project, the game manager is central to how many characters interact with each other and even how they interact with themselves. Therefore, before we move forward with any other pieces of the player or any of the allies or enemies, we're going to need that game manager. Creating a game object to be the game manager is actually quite simple. It's really just an empty game object. I'm going to go to the hierarchy and I'm going to select Create, Create Empty. Now I have an empty game object and its position in my scene is actually very irrelevant. It's simply going to be holding onto scripts and behaviors for me. So I'm going to click on its Y axis and I'm just going to move it way out of the way. Next, I'm going to name it Game Manager. The important parts of the Game Manager are the Game Manager script and the mouse position script. I'm going to open the scripts folder and then the managers folder. And inside here I can find the Game Manager script, which I'm going to click and drag onto my Game Manager game object. Now I can see that the Game Manager script has a lot of properties. We're not going to be using all of these properties right now. We're actually not even going to be using most of these properties right now. But let's take a look at what the Game Manager script is actually trying to do. The Game Manager script might seem quite large and confusing, but everything is grouped into relevant sections. We're pretty much only interested in the player properties right now. It's important to note though, on line 7, the first variable that exists inside this class. It is a public static Game Manager instance. What this means is that this game object, this Game Manager, has a reference to itself. That way other scripts can access the instance of this Game Manager without needing to do things like a GameObject.find or any form of searching or any form of passing a reference. Every game object in a scene will automatically be able to access this without searching for it. That's very useful and it speeds things up quite considerably. Line 10, we have something called a public player health. We don't have a player health script just yet, so we're going to ignore that for right now, though that again will come in handy here very shortly. Another thing we're interested in is line 11, where it says public transform enemy target. In this example, the enemy target is actually the player. What are the enemies targeting? The enemies are chasing the player, and so the player will be the enemy target. This is useful because the camera will also be chasing the player, and so the camera is not going to need a special property. The camera will simply follow the same target that the enemies are. Inside the awake function of the Game Manager, all it's doing is saving a reference to itself inside its instance variable. If for some reason more than one Game Manager exists at the same time in the same scene, one of them will destroy themselves, because we definitely do not want two of these at the same time. The rest of the code in this script is not really relevant right now, and so we'll come back to this later when it becomes relevant. The other script that's important for the Game Manager is located in the Helpers folder underneath the Scripts folder. That script is the mouse location script. The mouse location script is responsible for translating the mouse's position on your screen in 2D space, since your screen is 2D, it's flat, into the world in 3D space, so that the player can look at it, targeting reticules can follow it, and we always know where the mouse is pointing. We looked at this script in a previous chapter, however, we're going to briefly go through it again. Some of the interesting things about it are first off on lines 8 and 9, where we have public variables to specify where the mouse's position is in 3D space, and a boolean to tell us whether or not that mouse position is currently valid. It could be invalid for reasons like the mouse moved off the screen. There's a special attribute here called hide in inspector. That is because even though we want these mouse position and isValid variables to be public and thus able to be referenced outside of this script, we don't want them to appear in the inspector. So we're saying hide in the inspector. We'll see that the mouse position script also has a public static reference to itself. That way, we can access the mouse's position from any other script without needing a reference to it. Lines 30 through 35 have some code that changes depending on whether or not we're on a mobile platform or a platform with a keyboard and mouse. Lines 37 to 43 attempt to create a ray from the camera through the mouse's cursor position in 2D space into the world. If it hits a collider that is in the what is ground layer mask, it returns true and lets us know exactly where the mouse's position is. Some of the other code in the script is relevant specifically for handling mobile touch controls. As such, we'll come back and revisit this script when we get to mobile controls, as it's not very important to us right now. The last thing we want to do right now is specify what is ground on the mouse location script component on our game manager. If I click the layer mask dropdown, I see a list of all of the layers that exist within my project. I'm really only interested in the ground, or floor. I don't really want the mouse to track to things like shootable enemies or blocking game objects like the walls or the blocks or the house. I mostly want a flat, smooth surface which will translate to a nice smooth movement for my player and my reticules.